there was a precise moment in the history of our species. A moment when someone pointed to a speck of light among millions of specks of light and said, "That's where we're going." They called it Novara, a world 40 light years from Earth, with oceans, with mountains, with a young star that had been waiting for billions of years for someone to look at it and say, "Here we will build our homes. Here we will bury our dead. Here we will learn the name of everything." And we built the ship, the Anabasis. Because when humanity truly dreams, it does not stop. This is that story, the first interstellar exodus. The day we ceased to belong to just one world, we became something greater. When Novara was discovered, humanity had been facing a reality that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore for decades. Earth was no longer the stable home it had been for millennia. Ecosystems were collapsing, resources were running out. And with each passing year, it became more evident that time to find an alternative was running out. For the first time in history, our species possessed the technology needed to look beyond its cosmic neighborhood. That was when the first data from Novara arrived. It wasn't a perfect planet, nor was it a paradise, but it was real. It had oceans, an atmosphere compatible with human life, seasons, rivers, mountains, and enough space to start over. For years, observatories, universities, and research centers studied every piece of data received. The more we learned about the planet, the clearer one idea became. If humanity wanted to survive in the long term, it would have to learn to live on more than one world. Thus was born the Anabasis project, the greatest collective endeavor ever undertaken. It wasn't about sending a scientific expedition or organizing an exploration mission. It was about founding a new branch of humanity. Construction of the spacecraft began shortly thereafter, although many of its systems had been in development for decades. Plans had long been in place to ensure the survival of our species beyond Earth, should it ever become necessary. Novara turned those ideas into reality. The various designs were consolidated, budgets ballooned, and what had for years been a plan for the distant future eventually became the most ambitious project in history. The Anabasis took decades to complete. Orbital shipyards scattered throughout the solar system manufactured its various modules. Thousands of people devoted a significant portion of their lives to building something they would likely never get to use. When it was finished, the Anabasis resembled a city more than a spaceship. Its mission was simple to explain and nearly impossible to carry out: to keep a civilization alive for 500 years. Then the selection process began, and the whole world went crazy. The Anabasis had a capacity for 40,000 colonists. It seemed like an enormous number, but it wasn't. More than 100 million people applied for a spot. The authorities quickly realized that the problem wasn't finding candidates, but choosing them. Because they weren't putting together a crew, they were designing a society. For years, specialists from all disciplines tried to answer a question that had never before needed to be asked. How do you build a community capable of surviving for 500 years far from Earth? Families were given priority. So were emotional stability, genetic diversity, and the ability to ensure that life would continue from generation to generation during the journey. A portion of the mission was reserved for specialists who would travel in cryogenic suspension. People whose knowledge would be especially valuable centuries later, when the time came to build the first settlements on Novara. For millions of people, being chosen became the dream of a lifetime. Some studied for years to improve their chances. Many couples planned their future around the project, and entire families followed every stage of the selection process with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Meanwhile, something curious began to happen. People began to talk about Novara as if it were already inhabited. Cities were being designed and names were being discussed for regions that no one had ever seen. Schools were being planned for children who had not yet been born. Architects, urban planners, and farmers were working on blueprints intended for a world 40 light years away. Little by little, Novara ceased to be just a planet. It became an idea, a promise of the future. When the final results came in, 40,000 people realized they had just been entrusted with an extraordinary responsibility. They weren't about to embark on a mission. They were going to start a civilization. The chosen ones began preparing to leave. They sold their homes, said goodbye to their families, and recorded messages that would one day be seen by descendants they would never get to know. Little by little, they came to understand something that no previous generation had ever had to face. They weren't traveling for themselves. They were traveling for people who didn't yet exist. Because the Anabasis hadn't been built solely to transport 40,000 colonists to Novara. It had been built to transport the future of humanity. And when it finally left Earth's orbit, the longest journey in our history began. The first few years of the journey were strange. For decades, humanity had worked to build the Anabasis. Now, at last, it was beginning to be inhabited. At first, most of the colonists continued to think like Earthlings. They spoke of the places they had left behind, of the people they would never see again, and of a planet called Novara that still seemed incredibly far away. But little by little, something began to change. A routine took hold. Schools opened, greenhouses produced their first harvests, and neighborhoods began to fill with life. The Anabasis stopped feeling like a ship. It began to feel like home. The first births were celebrated by the entire community. It wasn't usual for an entire city to know the name of every newborn. But on the Anabasis, that's exactly what happened. Those children were special. They were the first human beings in history born among the stars. They didn't fully belong to Earth, and they didn't yet belong to Novara. They represented something new. As the decades passed, they grew up running through the indoor parks and studying in schools designed for a world they had not yet seen. They learned what the oceans, seasons, and skies of Novara would be like long before they could see them with their own eyes. For them, Earth was a place they knew through photographs, documentaries, and family stories. The Anabasis was everything else. There they learned, made friends, fell in love, and imagined their future. As the years went by, events unfolded that no previous generation had ever experienced. The first wedding between two people born during the journey. The first baby whose parents had also been born aboard the ship. The first entire generation that had never set foot on a planet. Difficult times also came. The first funeral and the farewell to those who had begun the journey. People who knew from the start that they would never see Novara with their own eyes, but who had nonetheless dedicated their lives to bringing others closer to it. Each generation received something from the one before: knowledge, stories, unfinished projects, and a shared responsibility to carry on. Meanwhile, Novara was taking up more and more space in the collective imagination. Children studied its continents in school. Teenagers participated in projects to design future neighborhoods and transportation systems. Engineers simulated entire cities. And farmers tested crops adapted to the conditions they expected to find. Some of the parks that would one day exist on Novara were designed by people who would never get to see them. And no one seemed to find it strange. That was the philosophy of the Anabasis: to build for those who would come after. Decades turned into generations, and generations into centuries. The ship continued to move forward through the darkness. But inside, life had not come to a standstill. On the contrary, the population grew, traditions evolved, customs changed, and even the way people spoke began to slowly transform. Humanity remained human, but it was no longer exactly the same humanity that had left Earth. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The long-range telescopes began to show more than just data and simulations. For the first time, Novara could be clearly seen. Its oceans, its clouds, its great mountain ranges. It was no longer just a promise. It was a real place. A world that had accompanied them for centuries and was now within their reach. After entire generations of preparing for that moment, the Anabasis entered the final stage of its journey. The arrival was drawing ever closer. After 500 years of travel, humanity had arrived. From orbit, Novara looked exactly like the world they had hoped to find. The atmosphere was breathable, the gravity was bearable, and everything seemed possible. However, observing a planet from a spaceship was not the same as living on it. The colonists had been born aboard the Anabasis, where every variation was detected and corrected. On Novara, the weather changed without warning. The nights were filled with unfamiliar sounds, and any expedition could encounter something that hadn't yet appeared on the maps. There was fear. The first crops died before completing their life cycle. Some seeds didn't even germinate. Others grew misshapen and depleted the soil's minerals within a few weeks. The water reacted with the filtration systems in ways no one had anticipated. Then the structural failures began. The foundations shifted. The ground seemed firm, but it gave way when saturated with moisture, forcing the dismantling of buildings even before they were finished. Every night, the colonists returned to the Anabasis modules. The wind damaged the equipment, storms struck earlier than forecast, and some forms of life approached the lit areas without anyone knowing what they were looking for. Everything they had prepared was beginning to become obsolete. The maps didn't match the terrain. Rainfall patterns changed from season to season, and climate models became unreliable just a few days after being updated. They had studied Novara for generations. But they had done so from afar. The first city was never completed. Every solution created a new problem. Diverting a river dried up the soil kilometers downstream. Isolating the fields altered the humidity, and eliminating one species allowed another to take its place. Nothing remained stable. Food began to run short. The Anabasis reserves could sustain the transition for a time. They could not feed the entire colony indefinitely. Every lost harvest reduced the time available, and hunger began to become a real possibility. For years, humanity responded by increasing control. Stronger structures were built, crops were enclosed, and terrestrial seeds were modified to force them to grow. That didn't work either. The plants managed to survive, but they damaged the soil. The microorganisms introduced to protect them escaped from the controlled zones, and the systems created to keep Novara out of the cities caused the cities to become even more dependent on the Anabasis. The planet could not be divided into independent parts. What happened in one valley affected the forests in another region. Changes made to a river reappeared months later on the coast, until one of those interventions came back to haunt them. A terrestrial bacterium, released to restore crops, reached the colony's main river. There it began to displace a local microorganism that played a role in rainfall formation. For months, it went largely unnoticed. Then, the clouds stopped coming. The valley dried up. Water reserves dwindled, and the first city had to be evacuated before it was even finished. Until then, everyone had been trying to figure out how to make their plans work. Now they were beginning to suspect that the real problem was the plans themselves. Novara was not a flawed world. It did not need its rivers, its soil, or its climate corrected. It had sustained life for millions of years before the Anabasis appeared in its sky. It was they who did not know how to live there. The colony was divided. Some argued that they should completely transform the planet. They had the technology, and apparently, it was the quickest option. But it could also destroy what made Novara habitable. Others realized that continuing down this path meant turning the planet into an incomplete copy of Earth. They had traveled to another world, but they hadn't yet left the previous one behind. Earth was still present in every plan, every crop, and every decision. Admitting the mistake meant starting over. Construction came to a halt. The most invasive crops were eliminated. Several areas were abandoned, and cities were no longer designed before the territory on which they were to be built was fully understood. It was the first truly Novarian decision. Because some worlds do not need to be conquered, they need to be understood. And that too transforms those who live there. The idea sparked even more fear, a great deal of fear. The mission had been designed to preserve humanity for 500 years. Now Novara was forcing them to decide how much they could change without ceasing to be themselves. It was no longer about building a colony. It was about learning to belong to a world that had never needed them to arrive. And it was then, when they stopped trying to conquer Novara and accepted that they too would have to transform, that their new civilization truly began. "400 years later, Novara is no longer the world that the first settlers sought to dominate. Cities do not grow on the land. They grow with it. Their structures change shape depending on humidity, close up before major storms, and redistribute their energy when migrations pass through inhabited areas. No two settlements are alike, because each responds to a different climate, soil, and balance. Nothing remains completely still, not even its inhabitants. Generations born on Novara can draw sustenance from a part of local life. Their organisms coexist with microorganisms that would have made the first settlers sick. And their bodies recognize the planet's cycles before the city's systems signal a change. Earth is no longer the measure of what it means to be human. The Anabasis remains in orbit, visible on some nights as a white line streaking across the sky. It is no longer a ship or a refuge. Inside, the last terrestrial forests are preserved, along with thousands of species that will never be able to roam freely on Novara, and the complete archives of the world they left behind. Citizens visit it once in a lifetime. Earth survives in its archives, its schools, and its languages. But for the inhabitants of Novara, it is no longer a home or a promise. It is the remote place where humanity began. For centuries, they had feared that adapting would mean losing themselves. And in a way, that's exactly what happened. Their bodies changed. So did their cities. But Novara did not destroy humanity. It forced humanity to understand that survival does not always mean remaining intact. Then the signal arrives. It comes from the solar system and has taken 40 years to travel the distance. Earth is still alive. It has overcome some of its past crises and has built new ships capable of traveling among the stars. Now it wants to reach Novara. The transmission speaks of the reunion between two separate branches of the same species. But the Novarians do not feel that a part of them is returning. They share an origin, not an identity. And for the first time, a question arises that had never before needed to be asked. Do they still belong to the same humanity? Humanity on Earth had survived by transforming everything around it. Novara had done the opposite. It had transformed human beings. Perhaps being human was never about preserving an exact form, but about being able to change without forgetting where you came from. Because that signal did not herald a reunion. It heralded the first encounter between two humanities.